Hello, it is the 113th day of Ukraine's resistance. We have today the four important speakers: Hanna Maliar, the Deputy Minister of Defense, Oleksii Hromov from the Chief Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksii Nadtochyi from the National Guard of Ukraine, and I'm going to give the floor to Hanna Maliar first, who will share about the situation at the front lines. Hello. Hello here at this traditional forum, or yeah, it's briefing, but I for some reason prefer the word forum today. So it's a briefing of defense forces, and right now we are sharing the information about the previous week, because we are doing these briefings once a week, and we can see the dynamics in the information of the Ministry of Defense. So the security situation in and around Ukraine is still complicated. It's the fourth month of the full-scale invasion, and the main strategic goals of Russia concerning our state is the full destruction of Ukrainian nation and Ukrainian government, also the destruction of the military and economic basis of our state. According to Ukraine's intelligence, since Russia is unable to advance successfully at several areas at once, the main efforts of Kremlin are right now focused on establishing full control over the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. For this purpose, the Russian troops are aiming to encircle and destroy the Ukrainian troops in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Zolote, and the neighboring communities. For this purpose, the Russian Federation is using different types of vehicles, and Iskander cruise missiles X-101, the cruise missiles Caliber are the most dangerous ones, because they can reach to any specific point in Ukraine. The main goal is to destroy storage facilities, the ammunition, the military equipment provided by Western partners, and also the enemy is intended to harm the transport infrastructure, which is used for the transportation of military and civilian supplies. And we foresee that Russia is going to continue its advance near Zolote, Lysychansk, and Severodonetsk, and aiming to get to the administrative border of Luhansk region. In the future, the actions of the Russian Federation will depend on availability of resources in Ukraine for the combat operations, and on the international support provided. Kremlin will going to exploit its military accomplishments in the negotiations. According to the Chief Investigating Department, Russia is going to strengthen the activities intended to hold the temporarily occupied territories. From time to time, we share the information on the specific actions of the enemy on the occupied territories, and now we can see that entire families of the military are being brought to the Ukrainian communities occupied by the Russian aggressor, specifically in the city of Kherson. And these people are being located in the left apartments and houses of Ukrainian citizens who have fled from the invasion on the 24th of February. Also, Russia is strengthening its activities to provide passports to the citizens in the occupied territories. And the electronic queue for getting the Russian passports takes 2 weeks. So the intention is to increase the percentage of the local population that would be supporting the Kremlin plans in terms of annexation of territories in case the so-called referendum is going to take place. Russia still has this plan of having the referendum. For now, the plans are unsuccessful because of the strong resistance of the local population, and also Ukrainians are working hard for these referendums to be impossible. Also, on a weekly basis, we inform about the procurements of the Ministry of Defense over the week. I do understand that you are all interested in the Ramstein format meeting, but we have emphasized time and again that we are not concentrating on the process of getting the weapons. We are commenting on the results, or we are also waiting for the outcomes of the weapons being provided. It's very important that this Ramstein format established by the US, it's now joined by Georgia, Moldova, Ecuador. A number of partners have already announced the deliveries, such as coastline defense and also communications equipment. On behalf of the Ministry of Defense, I would like to express gratitude to the partners who are right now supporting Ukraine in its fight against the occupier. Over the last week, in order to provide for the units of the armed forces of Ukraine, we have provided 33,000 of armored vests, 19,000 of helmets, and also thousands of pairs of boots and uniforms. We are already procuring warm clothes for the cold season. We are also expecting another 21,000 of armored vests and 5,000 helmets. It's going to happen recently, which means that the products have been shipped already and are on their way to the Ukrainian armed forces. In total, the Ministry of Defense has provided over 55,000 armored vests and over 27,000 helmets. As I have mentioned before, we are focusing on the stable and harmonized deliveries. We are intending to have reserves of armored personal protecting equipment for at least 2 brigades. So when the preparations are finished in a new brigade, the personal protective equipment should be ready, and also there should be a possibility of maneuvering resources. So this is what we are working on. As for the financial resources provided by the Ministry of Defense to the military units, which are paid to the servicemen, This is a chain that starts from the payments from the ministry, continues with the payment to the military units, etc. It all takes a couple of days, but all of this is fully traceable. So in January, over half of the months, the military units have received over 60 billion hryvnias, almost 26 billion hryvnias is the additional payment for the participation in the combat operations. The payments will be effected till June 20th, and in the next briefing you will see the total amount for May. 160,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory right now need to be surveyed for the presence of mines. National anti-mine activity body has been established, which ensures communication between different structures of government and also international demining organizations. We need to understand that these 160,000 square kilometers, this is something that makes us one of the most mine-polluted countries in the world, and Ukraine is expecting for additional support from Geneva Demining Center. Over the week, my colleague from the Ministry of Defense, Mr. Vyacheslav Shapovalov, had a meeting with Geneva Demining Center where the support has been discussed, the support that is necessary for the Ministry of Defense. From the legal standpoint, the Ministry of Defense is controlling the implementation of agreements and obligations. There were some issues with untimely repairs of military equipment and also untimely deliveries of oil products and fuels. Over the last week, the courts of Ukraine have imposed 12.4 billion hryvnias of penalties for the improper implementation of contracts. One of such examples was the case that have entailed the fine of 9.9 million hryvnias for failure to deliver timely repairs of the military equipment, specifically of the vehicles BRDM-2. Also, another court decision in Dnipro region has entailed a fine of 2.4 million hryvnias for the delays with deliveries of oil products for the special military equipment. So these were some of our legal victories. Speaking of the medics, over the last couple of weeks, our field surgeons have completed a number of unique operations. Replantation of segments of extremities, that's a special medical term. Replantation was conducted for 3 injured persons. In 3 cases, these were replantations of legs, and in 1 case, replantation of an arm. So in the conditions of big numbers of casualties, the system has to work in a comprehensive manner with every component functioning well, and only in such conditions it is possible for such operations to be conducted. This means well-orchestrated work of the doctors, of the surgeons, anesthesiologists, the use of highly advanced equipment and modern approaches at every stage of treatment of the patients. So the completion of such unique operations prove good coordination of all the departments of the medical services. We'll surely have some questions, thank you, and we will ask them after all the speakers finish with their remarks. Right now, let us give the floor to Mr. Oleksii Hromov, who will share information with us. Hello, everyone. The actions of the enemy over this so-called operation and the statements of the Russian Federation show that the purposes and targets for Ukraine are unchanged. But because of the sustained losses, the enemy has changed the order and focus of the efforts, focusing in the east of the country. Among other things, the enemy is working to get to the administrative borders of Luhansk and Donetsk regions, and also to halt the already occupied regions of Zaporizhia and Kherson, and also create conditions for the advance in Mykolaiv and Odessa region. Right now, Russia is using about 330,000 people for this full-scale invasion, out of which 150 servicemen arranged as battalion tactical groups, but with the air and sea component, the total number is up to 220,000 people. Also, there are mobilization reserves of about 80,000 people. The so-called BARS system, up to 7,000 people, the National Guard, 18,000 people, and also private military campaigns. And the Ukrainian armed forces are successfully repelling the enemy, and the main combat operations are happening in the east of Ukraine, near Severodonetsk and Bakhmut. Near Severodonetsk, the enemy is trying to overcome our troops and get the full control over Severodonetsk and Metyolkino communities. The situation in Severodonetsk is complicated. There are maneuvered defense, and the enemy, supported by the tanks, mortars, and artillery, is trying to force our forces out of Metyolkino and get to the border of Severodonetsk. For now, they are unsuccessful. In the nearest time, the enemy is going to continue its assault actions in order to get full control over Severodonetsk and force our troops to another bank of Seversky Donetsk. This will be done with support of artillery shelling, where the Ukrainian troops are stationed. Also, the use of MLRS against our troops in order to suppress their activity and prevent them from getting closer. Also, in Metyolkino and Sirotino, the enemy will try possibly to overcome the defense of Ukrainian troops. In order to prevent that, the military units defending Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which include land forces, special operation forces, territorial defense, National Guard, also some operational units, are working under united management to ensure effective defense. Additional mobile reserves are established, artillery reserves as well, to be able to respond to the changes in the situation quickly, and also timely provision of ammunition is ensured as well. Right now, 4 bridges over Seversky Donetsk are destroyed, but we have now defined, thanks to reconnaissance, several ways to deliver supplies to those stationed in Severodonetsk. Severodonetsk is a key point in the Luhansk area, and this is the way it should be perceived. Near Bakhmut, the enemy has taken assault actions to get control over the Bakhmut-Lysychansk highway, which is used to provide for our troops, especially near Teshkivka-Ustynivka and Kamyshovaha-Zolote. The enemy is trying to advance, but for now it has failed. According to radio intercepts, in Nirkova, Luhansk region, the enemy is using the special forces because the regular troops have refused to fight in that area. Also, it was confirmed that about 200 servicemen of the enemy have recently deserted the area. Near Bohorodechny and Slavyansk, there are attempts of advance. The combat operations continue. There are attempts to advance on Slavyansk, Dovhenki, and Krasnopilya. For now, the enemy is unsuccessful. The enemy is implementing some reconnaissance, but then retracting the forces back after Ukrainian attacks. Also, the artillery, mortars, and MLRS are used against Ukrainian troops in order to keep the Ukrainian troops in Kharkiv region. The enemy is holding its positions and prevents our troops from getting closer to the state border of Ukraine. Also, in order to keep our troops, aviation is used, air raids supported by MLRS as well, along almost all of the contact line. Also, the enemy is trying to attempt to get back some of the territories that were liberated. In southern regions of Ukraine, the efforts of the enemy are concentrated on keeping the previously occupied territories. Along the border with Belarus, there are no signs of any preparations for the advance. Belarus troops are protecting the border, and one of the ways to do that is through using caters on Dnieper. Also in Pinsk region, some enforced fortifications are being developed. In other areas, the enemy is not taking any active actions, but in order to show its presence in Bryansk and Kursk regions, some amounts of troops are remaining. There are some aviation attacks and shellings. In Bessarabia region, there are no signs of advance of the enemy, and we are not noticing any movements of troops as well. In the Black and Azov Sea, there are enemy warships which are supporting their planned efforts and which are also effecting missile attacks against our country. And there is still a threat of entire Ukraine being under attack. Over the last day, the number of such attacks was 6, and the previous day, the number was 9. So the analysis of the actions of the Russian Federation Army shows that there are certain specific features in the use of forces. The land forces are used through small units, platoons supported by the tanks. The full scale of the use of forces is almost not noticed. Usually the combat operations are happening during the day. In order to ensure favorable operational mode, the enemy is using its National Guard and other types of forces, including private military campaigns. Also, the enemy is installing engineering structures in the occupied territories. In Kherson region, for instance, the enemy is using concrete material taken off the roads. And also the enemy is masking the enemy position. Also in the motorized infantry groups, some Marines are used by the enemy. The missile forces and artillery of the enemy are used according to the unified plan of the Russian command, and thanks to that, there is no opportunity for any specific commander to use any of the units in its own interests. So the artillery component is quite strong. The enemy is using .U systems and multi-launch rocket systems. It also uses heavy fire systems. Also, the above water warships are actively used for the attacks. Also, the enemy is using small numbers of aviation. The main efforts are intended to affect the units on the front lines, and in total, the armed forces of Ukraine have a good understanding of the enemy actions. The head staff of Ukraine has developed the strategy with stages developed. Ukraine will prevail, and the only question is the question of time and question of the provision of resources. The faster the resources arrive, the faster we get our victory. And our next speaker is Leonid Baran from the State Bodyguard Service. Thank you. Dear colleagues, let me greet everyone who is present here. And as a representative of the administration of the State Bodyguard Service, I'll start with a statement that we are continuing to defend our country together with the armed forces of Ukraine. We are also ensuring the security of the state border, where the situation is quite tense, and the border guard units are following the general plan of the General Staff of Ukraine, while the enemy is intensifying its advancement. the positions are kept on the constant shelling of the aggressor, and Ukrainian defenders are doing their best to hold their positions steady. There are no considerable changes on the border with Belarus, and in Brest and the Gomel regions, the tasks are being implemented to strengthen the border with Ukraine. There are about 7 battalions. We are also aware of certain units of internal units. In Belarus, the engineering structures are being installed, and we are also noticing quite active use of the tools of electronic warfare. Also, there is a threat of missile attacks from the territory of Belarus, the attacks of infrastructure facilities of our country. The situation on the border with Moldova is generally unchangeable, and we are strengthening the defense, taking preventive actions to prevent any provocations on the state border. The locations are being strengthened with the engineering and fortification works. On the northern border with the Russian Federation, over 800 kilometers of which have been liberated already, the enemy is still keeping the military units in the regions along the border with Ukraine in Bryansk and Kursk regions. And the enemy is right now not forming the units for advance, but still Russia is quite active in shelling Chernihiv and Sumy regions. Such actions pose a threat to civilians as well. The enemy is using artillery, small arms, UAVs throwing bombs on the positions of the bodyguards as well. And since the beginning of the month, there were 160 cases of shelling and aviation and weapon attacks of these territories. The artillery shellings from Belarus are not being observed. Speaking of the situation on the border with the EU and Moldova, on average, the numbers of people crossing the border each day is between 80 and 85,000 people in each direction. The numbers of people leaving Ukraine are not increasing, but the numbers of those entering Ukraine on personal vehicles are quite high, although the lines are shorter than in May. In total, over 9 million of people have crossed the border. 5.7 of them are people leaving the territory of Ukraine, the majority of which are Ukrainian citizens. At the same time, 3 million people entered Ukraine, and the border with Poland is the most active in terms of numbers of people and tons of goods delivered. People crossing the border are generally women, children, elderly, and sometimes men. Of course, there are some limitations for men age between 18 and 60. This requirement, however, has a big number of exceptions, and the bodyguard service is following the current legislation, ensuring the possibility of crossing the border for such categories. So these are the drivers, the athletes, the railway employees, the men who are recognized as unsuitable for service, those who were exempt from the military enlistment, and also those who reside abroad on a permanent basis, and they have the documents to attest that. And also there are people who are being who are getting higher education, also people with disabilities, also people who accompany persons with disabilities. On a daily basis, we apprehend the men who have limited access to the border and who try to cross the border illegally. Over the last day, there were 40 persons apprehended in this regard, and over the months, 3,500 people on the so-called green sections of the border, and the rest of them at the border crossing points. They tried to use fake documents. New schemes are being discovered, and we are working to prevent illegal crossing of the border. Thank you so much for your attention. And our final speaker here before we proceed with Q&A is Oleksii Nadtochyi from the National Guard of Ukraine. Hello, everyone. I will briefly share about the role of the National Guard of Ukraine in fighting against the military aggression. In cooperation with the armed forces of Ukraine and other security and defense agencies, we are implementing our tasks in Slobozhansk, Donetsk, Southern Bug, and Bessarabia regions. We are conducting raids in order to deblock the city of Kharkiv. Also, the units of the National Guard of Ukraine are holding the lines near Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Slavyansk, Lysychansk, Mariinka, and Mykolaiv cities with all the necessary bravery. The servicemen are holding the enemy attack near Severodonetsk, and also we are holding the enemy from proceeding near Borislav and Kryvyi Rih. We are protecting the critical infrastructure assets. In Kyiv region, the defense preparations are being done. Also in the northern part, we are supporting the strengthening of the Ukraine-Belarus border, and we are also implementing the tasks of territorial defense. There are no considerable changes in the tasks implemented by the National Guard of Ukraine, which holds all the positions quite successfully. Some positive examples over the last week. The aviation of the National Guard has successfully attacked the enemy. There were 9 air raids. There were some air reconnaissance with UAVs in 5 cases. Also, there were 96 cases of helicopter flights. The reconnaissance has discovered 419 targets of the enemy, some of them with electronic warfare equipment, some of them with aerial vehicles. And here are some examples. The positions of signal intelligence of the enemy in Kharkiv were discovered in Kharkiv region, and they were destroyed by the artillery. It is clear that the enemy is using electronic warfare tools as one of the powerful ways to limit the Ukrainian troops because, of course, the communications are a necessary part of the warfare. And thus, by targeting their electronic warfare tools, we are limiting the enemy capacities. In another case, a big allocation of the storage facilities of ammunition and also big numbers of the enemy troops were discovered, thanks to which this place was destroyed, both the ammo depot, also some of the enemy vehicles, and also near Severodonetsk, thanks to the UAV, some multi-launch systems of the enemy, Grad systems, were discovered. They were used to shell Severodonetsk and other locations and positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. The artillery has destroyed 3 and armed 1 artillery systems. So these are some of the many episodes of effective collaboration of the National Guard of Ukraine and the armed forces of Ukraine. The engineering units are continuing their work to demine the territories. In total, 106 hectares were cleared, and in total, 16 demining groups are presented by the National Guard, 5 of which are working in Kyiv region. On a daily basis, they are surveying up to 2 hectares of the territory in order to ensure security of our citizens. The participation of territorial defense is also continuing. The defense of highly important locations, the defense of regional and local importance facilities, and also fight against the sabotage groups of the enemy by means of search and isolation activities. And since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we can see the enemy agents and sabotage groups becoming more active. In order to discover them, the vehicles of citizens are being checked, and the checkpoints at the entrances to the cities. And 24/7, this service is working on the 173 checkpoints, which enables the discovery of enemy agents and also confiscation of the weapons. In total, 126 persons were apprehended, suspected of participation in the enemy sabotage groups. In total, over 2,000 people were apprehended for all kinds of administrative and criminal offenses. And in total, 42 units of weapons and 2,500 units of ammunition were confiscated. So, are there any questions? If yes, please raise your hands and get the microphone. Hello, I'm Oleksii from SensorNet. So my question goes to Ms. Maliar concerning the provisions for the army. I'd like to go back to the statement by President Zelensky made a couple of days ago, and also the orders given to Valery Zaluzhny about providing the Ukrainian military with armored vests. So there were many questions about the this statement by the president, because it's a ministry dealing with the supplies of personal protective equipment. And question number two, in this chain of supplies, which link is the most problematic? Thank you so much for your questions. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine is performing the procurement according to the orders of the General Staff of Ukraine. It does not have any storage facilities, so the numbers of the products delivered are delivered directly to the warehouses of the armed forces of Ukraine, and from there they are distributed to the military units. So we are procuring, and then the logistics and the logics of distribution is managed by the armed forces of Ukraine. This is how it is defined by the law. And we need to be clear about this formula that consists of the three components: the financial possibilities of the Ministry of Defense, the possibility of contractors to deliver, and the logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine that enable deliveries to each service person. Thus, there are these discussions happening quite often because of the fact that there is no clear understanding in our society about the responsibilities of each party in this chain. So, of course, the procurement is done by the Ministry of Defense, but once again, we are doing the procurement, and then we are not dealing with the distribution of goods. So we cannot influence the fact of deliveries of products to some particular military unit. Other questions? I actually have a question. So the situation is as follows. It is happening in Odessa region, but not only there, in some other regions as well. They are apprehending some administrative offenders, and these people are also issued the documents summoning them to the army. Is there any possibility to impact somehow this situation? Because actually being called to join the army is an honor, not a punishment for some kind of offense. What should be communicated in this case? Well, speaking of this practice, of course, there are some cases, but we all need to understand that our government right now needs some mobilization resources. Still, we have quite big numbers of conscious citizens who express their willingness to perform their constitutional duties and to protect the state. As of now, we have established quite a big number of reserve units. We have provided additional mobilizational resources for military units, but we should also remember that our task for the future is to protect the state borders of Ukraine, the borders defined by the Ukrainian law. Thus, the territories of our country that have been liberated, they need to be supported thanks to the mobilization resources. And there are two components here. There are Ukrainian service persons, and there are weapons. So again, this should not be perceived as some kind of punishment, because this is something used by the Russian propaganda in such a case. Well, speaking of the mobilization resources and Russian propaganda, let's give the following example. According to our intelligence in the city of Horlivka in the temporarily occupied territories, the local civilians refuse to join the armed units of that self-proclaimed republic, and thus they lead to failure of the provision of the numbers of servicemen they need. Also, we are noticing the cases of the prevention of the mass exodus of Russian military, and for this purpose, the lies are being spread about the duration of contracts, and they are telling the servicemen that it is impossible right now to interrupt the contracts. They are basically forcing their servicemen to think that in case they disrupt the contract, they can face administrative responsibility and thus will be unable to get the financial compensation. Yes, that's true. I've seen such statements in Russia. People who deny the service in the Russian army, they are later not given jobs. Also, I would like to add that we are providing explanations concerning mobilization on a regular basis, and this is highly relevant. We are collecting the statements of the press, and we are providing the explanations many times concerning the summoning of a serviceman. And for instance, the land forces have provided explanations on many occasions. So there are no legal limitations on the locations where such documents can be issued. Also, the fact that a person gets such a document does not necessarily mean that the person will be mobilized, because the health condition and the data of the person need to be corrected, and only after that the actions will be taken to mobilize the person. I'm Pavlo Valkovsky from Ukraine Forum. I'd like to ask Mr. Hromov, what is known about the capabilities of the enemy to advance on Kyiv once again, if such decision is made? I have shared the information today that right now we are not observing any actions of the enemy in the Kyiv region right now. All the efforts of the enemy, all the troops of the enemy are used for the military aggression of our country, but there is a possibility of some refilling of the forces by means of overt or covert mobilization. And in this case, there is a possibility of advancement in the future and advancement on Kyiv as well. But some time would surely be necessary for this. If there are no further questions, well, we will have quite an in-depth presentations. I'm very grateful to our speakers. We had Hanna Maliar, Oleksii Hromov from the General Staff of Ukraine, Mr. Baran from the State Border Guard, and Mr. Nadtochyi from the National Guard of Ukraine. See you here next time.